Thank you, I must say. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. As you know, in the mid-1990s, the Singapore Prime Minister said publicly, the dream of Singapore is to become the Switzerland of Asia. So I'm very happy to be invited to participate in a panel on how Switzerland is doing. I guess the key point I wanted to respond to is the emphasis that David gave to multilateralism. You know, as someone who served actually as ambassador to the UN twice, from 84 to 89 and 98 to 2004, and I was a very close personal friend of Kofi Annan, I'm a passionate believer in multilateralism. And I actually believe that the 21st century can be much more stable, even though we're going to manage the biggest shift of power ever seen in human history. Let's be very clear about one point, okay? The titanic struggle that has begun between the US and China, which I document in my book as China One, is probably the biggest ever power struggle in human history because of the size and scale of these two powers. It's much greater than the former Soviet Union, the former Germany, or whatever it is. It's a very different scale. And sometime within the next 10 years, the likelihood is that China is going to become bigger than the United States. So there's going to be a massive transformation taking place. And in the face of these massive transformations, clearly the interests of small states will be affected and be endangered. So what do we do? How do we protect ourselves as this great power struggle gains momentum in the 2020s? And the answer is multilateralism. And here, I know I heard the previous discussion, Patrick, that you chaired, and there was a lot of bad news at that session. But you must also spot the good news that's happening in the world. And one of the pieces of good news is that actually China believes that the current rules-based order is good for China. You know, and believe me, China could have arrived at an opposite conclusion. China could have said, hey, this 1945 rules-based order, the UN Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these are Western creations. We should get rid of them. You know, now that China's number one, China should create its own rules-based order. And that could have happened. And that would be a horror scenario, frankly, for the world. But the fact of the matter is that China has decided pragmatically. They don't accept all, by the way. Of course, they're going to change some things. But by and large, China is happy with the current rules-based order, because if you look at the last 20 years, for example, in the year 2000, United States GNP was 8 times the size of China's. Today is 1.5 times, and within 10 years, China will become bigger. How did China manage to do this? On the basis of the current rules-based order, on the basis of the World Trade Organization, and on the basis of all the other UN institutions. So China is a beneficiary. And the fact that China doesn't want to disrupt or overturn this global system is good for the world. And so our role as small open economies, to answer your question, and Singapore, as you know, is the most open economy in the world. Our total trade is more than 3.5 times the size of our GNP. You know? No other country comes close in that sense. And so for us, this rules-based order is absolutely fundamental for Singapore's national interest. So we actually believe that the small countries, small open economies should speak out even more strongly in the United Nations and in every forum to say, let's preserve and strengthen this institution. So just to give one example, the World Trade Organization, we should try and persuade the United States to stop its policy of, as you know, blocking the appointment of judges, because this is a time when, frankly, you need to strengthen the WTO rather than weaken the WTO. You also got to persuade the United States, stop leaving WHO, going in, going out, going in. That's also bad for the world. So we should speak out and say, yes, let's preserve this 1945 rules-based order.
Thank you for these additions. Kristy, your take on the discussion so far?
Yes, I want to first thank the organizer for inviting me to this very prestigious forum, and I enjoy listening to all the previous session and David's presentation. course, Switzerland is also one of the model that Taiwan has been looking for our development, development goal. We do share a lot of same concerns with Switzerland as open, small economies. We don't have a China strategic per se, but in the past 3 years, we do have adopted a changing or a different approach towards handling relations, including political and economic relations with China. So I heard Taiwan was mentioned a couple of times in the previous section because Taiwan or Taiwan's ICT or semiconductor industry has been among the center of the world's attention since escalation of the geopolitical tension between the U.S. and China since 2018. Can you hear me clearly? Okay.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. Okay. As a small open economy, Taiwan shares all concerns with other small open economy. Taiwan has every characteristics of a small open economy. Firstly, Taiwan has a very small population and hence a small domestic market. It has very limited supply of labor, land, and other resources, and these factors have pushed Taiwanese company, large-sized company or small and medium-sized company, to develop outward-looking business. And they always think about international markets instead of Taiwan's domestic market. Secondly, due to scarcity of domestic labor and limited natural resources, Taiwan companies began offshoring manufacturing since the 1980s, while focused to develop only a few industrial sectors at home, for example, the ICT and electronics and also the semiconductor. In order to take advantage of these resources and market opportunities in larger host countries, mainly China. And thirdly, Taiwan has a very high degree of openness. When Taiwan was admitted to the WTO in 2002, Taiwan committed to reducing significantly its tariffs and to liberalizing most of its services sectors, to the extent that surpassed most advanced economies at that time. And this year, 2022, marks Taiwan's 20th anniversary of its WTO membership. And Taiwan has enjoyed WTO membership and hugely benefited from trade liberalization for 20 years. However, this has also made Taiwan highly dependent on international trade as well as a well-functioning multilateral trading system. And this part was also mentioned in earlier session. Now, about how Taiwan responded to the geopolitical tensions. The first point is in the current sentiment of deglobalization and economic nationalism, trade protectionism spreading quickly in the past several years have huge impacts on small open economies. Taiwan, South Korea, and some Southeast Asian countries are usually regarded benefited from globalization. In this current deglobalization sentiment expands, Taiwan will definitely be adversely impacted. And the second point is the escalation of the geopolitical tension between U.S. and China has made Taiwan rethink its overall external relations and economic development models, and hence a need to adopt a different approach. For example, China has been the most important destination of our investment in the past 2 decades. However, since in last year, our investment going to Southeast Asia actually is much more larger than our investment going to China, because Taiwanese company now adopt a more balanced and cautious approach and strategy towards Chinese market. So Taiwanese companies since in the last 3 years have become more globalized, and now they are thinking more of the international market. And in the meantime, Taiwanese government has adopted a new approach to have more friends with shared value and common interest. I believe this new development will put Taiwan in a new development model, and they may be the beginning of a new paradigm shift to have Taiwan moving into a more a healthier and also sustainable economic structure. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristy. Yes, Markus, your take on this?
Yes, thanks a lot, Patrick. Thank you very much for hosting this very timely forum. I can say from speaking to companies and trade association across Europe, this is really on top of everyone's mind, multipolarity, and great to be here. Thank you for the input from David. I would like to come back to the topic David described as values-based versus pragmatism. I think Patrick was also suggesting that this conflict there. And I would like to add two broader thoughts on this one. I think the commonality is basically we have to stay realistic in some way on the threshold that we apply in this trade-off to SMOPEX, to the smaller, basically open economies. I think the first one that I would add is saying, is basically the question of to what extent are the larger powers, and I would like to now connect to the previous panel, are they basically still in this rule-based system? I think from our practice, observing smaller countries, we basically see that there's a lot of forces from different global players that are basically try to sidestep rules and try to enforce alignment and followership. A second example I have for basically the larger powers is the EU example itself. The EU has a so-called Trinity policy towards China. It's basically saying we compete, we cooperate, and we also are rivals. I think this formula in itself, it has a clear element of pragmatism, because you cannot be black and white. It's basically a mixed formula, and we actually see the Biden and his administration now starting to reference to this formula. But now, if we take the case of Switzerland, even if we want to be value oriented, as David was saying, and then basically put emphasis on dialogue, I think there's multiple arguments that I keep hearing that I also find important for the dialogue. I think the first one is, well, values are also interests. Basically, any value expression is international politics. So if you make a value, if you basically join the EU sanctions against China, that's not just value, that's also interest. And I think we have to consider that. Maybe the second element I would add, it's also explicitly in the China strategy, is the question of when we make value statements, do we actually want to stay coherent with ourselves, or are we trying to change basically the other country that we're talking about? The China strategy, I think very interestingly, David didn't mention it, is basically mentioning that Switzerland's China strategy is not starting from a position of strength. It's not a position of wanting to change China. It's basically wanting to optimize its relations towards China. And I think in this same bucket, Switzerland voted the COVI initiative. It's a supply chain act, basically last year. And I think one concept we can all consider is basically to say, in particular SMOPEX, is basically to stay true to the own value system. And that leads me maybe to my final argument here. If you take Article 54, Article 54.2 of the Swiss Federal Constitution, it actually says that we have to work for the good and advance the good and democracy and human rights in the world. I think basically the question is now also, how would we interpret or reinterpret that very clear, noble and important and defining feature in the Swiss Federal Constitution against the world of real world politics? And I think taking this together, the question is basically, what is a realistic threshold that we should apply to SMOPEX?
You know, in theory, small states are very weak and very vulnerable, and the big states have all the power and they can step on you and crush you. And certainly some of that theory is true. You really got to be very careful when you deal with great powers. So, for example, I mean, I think it's very realistic for Switzerland to say that it's not trying to change China. I mean, no country can change China except China. And that's what I think all of China's neighbors accept as a reality. But one big lesson I learned in my 33 years as a Singapore diplomat is that small states are not helpless. And I'll give you a few examples of how we can make a difference. Firstly, when I served as ambassador from 84 to 89, before the end of the Cold War, we used to have lots of debates in the General Assembly. And I found that the three most powerful weapons that an ambassador of a small state has, the three weapons are: number one, reason; number two, logic; number three, charm. And with reason, logic, and charm, you can actually persuade a lot of people, and sometimes even shame the big countries into changing their positions because they see that their positions are not reasonable or logical. And so I actually found that, and I studied philosophy, by the way. That was my training and background. So if you give good reasons, good arguments, it carries the day, and people get, then even the big powers get embarrassed and then will shift their position. So it's very important for small states to speak out and not be quiet. That's very critical. And that's why Singapore has launched something called the Forum of Small States. I think about 100 states or plus are members of this Forum of Small States. That's one example. The second example is that we have also found, from Singapore's point of view, that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has been a wonderful buffer for Singapore, and also enabled Singapore to accomplish much bigger things. So for example, we started off to have first an ASEAN free trade area. And then ASEAN has actually successfully now had free trade areas with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India. And it's quite amazing. And ASEAN has just pulled off a great miracle that no one has noticed. Starting in this month, in January 2022, the biggest miracle that ASEAN has pulled off is to launch the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's largest free trade agreement. And it wasn't initiated by any great power, by the way. It wasn't initiated by China, or wasn't initiated by Japan or anyone else, but by the ASEAN countries. And the amazing thing is that the three biggest economies in East Asia are those of China, Japan, and South Korea. Now you try and put the diplomats from China, Japan, and South Korea in the same room and ask them to talk to each other and agree on a free trade. They cannot agree on anything. Japan and South Korea refuse to sit in the same room with each other. Okay, but under the ASEAN umbrella, they came in, and under the RCEP umbrella, ASEAN has delivered a free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea. And that's where a lot of the boost of growth is going to come from our region. See, again, you see, it's a very powerful thing that came out of the actions of small states by leveraging ASEAN. So that's another tool you can use. And of course, in the case, the final point I'll make is that, for Singapore's point of view, Singapore can play a very, very special role in the world, because Singapore is, on the one hand, definitely an Asian state. I mean, 75% of the population is Chinese, 15% Malay, 6% Indian. I'm ethnically Indian. So it's a very multiracial Asian state. And yet Singapore is also the most westernized city in Asia. It functions in English. Its legal system is English. Its political system is British. So it's actually an amazing sort of like a Western state right in Asia. So a state like Singapore can play a very important bridging role between East and West at a time when you're going to see the resurgence of many Asian economies in the world. So I would say that my big message, therefore, is small states should not see themselves to be helpless. They have tremendous agency that they can use in the 21st century.
Okay, I'll shortly respond to this question. the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, which is the world's largest semiconductor producer. And Taiwan produces every year more than 65% of the advanced chips to the global market. And in the April issue last year, the Economies magazine had an article. The topic is how TSMC has mastered the geopolitics of chip making. So this is one example that Taiwan can play. We don't have too much room, or we cannot play a very active role in terms of in political fields, but economically and especially in this advanced technology, when major countries and smaller countries are talking about resilience of supply chain and digital transformation, green transformation post-pandemic, and also when Europe is using the term strategic autonomy, and Taiwan can actually play a very important role. For example, the TSMC, the company just mentioned, has responded to Trump and also Biden government to set up a chip making factory in the US. And Japan has also passed a rule to provide generous funding to support TSMC's operation in Japan. And I understand that a number of European countries are also considering to invite TSMC or other very important chip makers coming to Europe. So in this regard, that we don't have a lot of labor-intensive industries in Taiwan because they are all being outsourced to China, Southeast Asia, even Latin America. But we do have this technology and also this innovation, and especially this very important talents trained and educated in Taiwan. So in that regard, I believe that a small state like Taiwan can actually develop a much important relations with major economies and also other small economies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Probably Markus first, and then Kishore again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Markus?
Thanks. I'll just thank you. I'll just add some thoughts on the opportunities. I think economically speaking, I think it's very, very difficult. Basically, if I think apart from trade diversion or maybe regulatory arbitrage gains, you only have tactical benefits. But I think as a small PEC in a multipolar world, I think you may have political opportunities. But then the political opportunities will only basically be viable for more or less neutral small PECs. And I think there's not so many candidates. Singapore, of course, is one of them. Switzerland, and then already tier 2, probably Norway, New Zealand, most likely not because of the Five Eyes. And the question is basically, Singapore has achieved something that Ambassador Mahbubani, you alluded to it. I think we really should say it. I think it's really impressive. I think it's not just the RCEP, but the fact that Singapore has basically FTAs with EU, US, China, UK. You basically have all the geopolitical poles. And I think if you compare it to the Swiss situation, I think Switzerland has strong sovereignty interests and is in a context of higher political and economic integration if you compare Singapore to ASEAN. So basically, Switzerland could not achieve that type of geopolitical SMOPEC positioning that Singapore has. I really think it's unique, and it's good that we are in close dialogue with Singapore. But Switzerland has other possibilities. I think David just started to talk about them. We have the International Geneva, and when Kristy was speaking about TSMC, I actually metaphorically basically put them to a similar level. Basically, the TSMC in Taiwan is kind of our International Geneva that is sitting in Switzerland. But I think what I said earlier, just to also calibrate that a bit, because I was arguing for a lower threshold of value expectation towards SMOPECs. But I think that's not a free pass to that basically just be only pragmatic. I would argue for Switzerland, it actually has a moral obligation in whatever international relation terms you want to use that, to actually play an active brokerage neutrality. And I think we see it. We see it actually coming from the federal, from the MFA that David is representing. I'll just give you one example that is not very well noted, but I think it's a very interesting example. It's called GESTA. It's a new foundation based in Geneva, and is actually trying to contribute to rulemaking on a multilateral level through anticipatory science. So it's basically trying to see what's down the road ethically and rulemaking as a challenge if we extrapolate from current technological developments. And I think that's something that it's a big opportunity for Switzerland. And to me, it basically complements the moral aspect of if you want, a lower value threshold of a SMOPEC like our country.
Thank you. Kishore, you would like to add to that? Yeah.
No, I want to say that I agree with David when he says that China doesn't comply with multilateral rules 100% of the time, and that China violates some multilateral rules. And I would say that that's sadly a feature of all great powers. And no great power is a virtuous great power. And the one man who was very honest with me on this was the former head of the National Intelligence Council of the United States of America. Was a friend of mine. He said to me, Kishore, I can understand why you, as a small state, why you love multilateralism, because multilateralism and multilateral institutions enhance the impact and influence of small states. But he says, from the United States point of view, multilateral institutions are constrained on our power. And therefore, that's why the United States, basically, since I would say 30, 40 years, has been trying to weaken multilateral institutions by starving them of money and so on and so forth. And also breaking some rules. I mean, I wrote a book called The Great Convergence that describes all this. But and it's something that we have to accept as a reality. That, for example, everyone says China hasn't accepted the decision of the International Law of the Sea Tribunal. Well, the World Court has said that US and UK should leave Diego Garcia. The US and UK will not leave Diego Garcia. That's what great powers do. They will not be moved by rule of law, and the United States has condemned other countries for practicing torture. But then the United States was the first major developed country to reintroduce torture in Guantanamo. And as you know, most European states are very pragmatic. They didn't criticize the United States publicly. So these are the realities of great power politics that we have to deal with. So we have to deal with the fact that great powers will always push for their own interests. The question is, how do we nudge these great powers towards a greater balance, towards supporting the rules-based order and less of undermining it? And actually, I believe, and I've had lots of candid conversations in private with very senior American, Chinese, and other policymakers, and I would say that they would actually agree that in many ways it is in the end interest now in a small interdependent global village that we live in. It's actually now their interests have changed, and they have a greater interest in supporting the rules-based order because their lives are so interconnected. And if you want proof, just look, number one, COVID-19 can start in one place and the world shuts down for 2 years, right? And even if you stop it from one source, a new strain emerges in South Africa, boom, Europe and America get affected. So we are a global village. And then you look at climate change, the greatest imperative. You haven't mentioned climate change. There's no way we can take care of climate change unless we all come together. So I think we have to, therefore, the small states, keep nudging these great powers and say, actually, it's in your interest to support this rules-based order that we are also supporting. I think it can be done.
Yes. Of course, Taiwan has been watching the RCEP since it launched its negotiation back in 2012, and actually, not many people believe that it will actually enter into force since January 1st this year, thanks to the COVID-19, and that make all Southeast Asian countries believe that economic recovery by having RCEP can help them better, can have better economic strength among themselves. So RCEP is very important in the sense that it is, as Ambassador just mentioned, it is the first time that China, Japan, and South Korea are together in the one trade pact. These three countries has been talking about this CJK FTA for many years, but still very, very progressing very, very slow. So the first time for these three giants in East Asia in this economic integration, and also the first time that they put many new issues, digital economy, e-commerce, and all other new issues in this very important trade pact. So I believe that the RCEP, since it is launched this year, will definitely have a lot benefits in further booming regional economy, and it will also have a particular attraction to attract Taiwanese companies to invest in Southeast Asia, because we don't expect that Taiwan can join the RCEP anytime soon. But I would also like to call your attention to another regional trade agreement, which is the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Free Trade Agreement, that entered into force back in 2018, and among its 11 signatories right now, I think eight states have already ratified this pact. China submitted for the applications. China is already part of the RCEP, and China has already applied for the membership of the CPTPP. Taiwan also applied for the membership of the CPTPP, because CPTPP allows states as well as APEC economies to participate as signatories. So we believe that it will be very important to see how the RCEP will have more members to join, and how the CPTPP will allow new members such as China as well as Taiwan to be part of it, because these two FTA will definitely shape a new trade rules in Pacific region, and will be very, very important for all economies, not only for Asia but also for other parts of the world.
CPTPP started off, I think, with 4 small countries: Chile, New Zealand, Brunei, Singapore, I think, proposing it. And then the timing was very good. And because what happened was that this is in the Obama administration. The Obama administration was waking up to the challenge from China. And then they realized that they had to make sure that the United States remained a player in East Asia. And so this one thing I want to emphasize about free trade agreements: that free trade agreements are in theory about economics. In practice, they are about geopolitics. And the reason why Obama administration signed on to the CPTPP is partly for economic reasons, but fundamentally for geopolitical reasons, to ensure that the United States was firmly entrenched economically in East Asia. And of course, its friends of the United States, like Singapore, want the United States to stay in this region, and therefore we supported the United States signing the TPP. And as you know, the Obama administration did sign the TPP. But the tragedy here is that the United States, which used to be the #1 advocate of free trade agreements in the 60s, 70s, 80s, has now reached a situation where it's impossible for the US Congress to sign any FTA, because free trade has become toxic in the United States. And of course, as you know, Donald Trump pulled away from the TPP, but when Donald Trump pulled away from the TPP should have collapsed, because the biggest member left. But what's impressive is that the remaining 11 members said, no, we will not let this collapse. We will carry on with it. And so you have 2 parallel free trade agreements. The RCEP is what they call a low standards agreement. Any country can join. the bar is very low. CPTPP is a very high standards agreement. It's very difficult to join. You have to accept very, very stringent regulations and so on and so forth. And here, the stunning thing that's happened, that despite the high standards, as you know, as Kristy mentioned, China has applied to join. And this is actually one of the most shocking things that has happened in world history today, that you have a situation where United States, which used to be the creator of concepts of free trade, the greatest believer in free trade, walking away from free trade agreements, and China, that used to be a closed economy for so long, is now willing to join the most intrusive free trade agreement. That's how world history has changed fundamentally. So my answer to the question is, what we need to see, certainly in East Asia, is more free trade agreements. It's okay to have RCEP, CPTPP, and others, because it's okay to have multiple agreements happening. And that, frankly, those agreements will actually support the multilateralism that David spoke about earlier. That each free trade agreement creates another layer of multilateralism and forces countries to sit down, talk, cooperate, and work together. And when that happens, by the way, the reason why ASEAN, which is the most diverse region on planet Earth, okay, out of 650 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, and Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, and you have got everything. It should be the Balkans of Asia. It should be fighting each other. Why is it not fighting? Because of trade, free trade agreements. So multilateralism does work in East Asia.
Yes, I would like to add, and I'll just pick up quickly on what Ambassador Mahbubani said when he qualified FTAs primarily as a geopolitical instrument. The WTO has repeatedly in its studies shown a very high correlation between global value chains and free trade agreements. So basically, I would at least call it strategic economics. You can get, or geoeconomics, you can get close to geopolitics, but there is a strong rationale, and I think it's not by coincidence that China's applying for CPTPP that you mentioned. I think there's a political motive to be first. Well, the US did not say or did not restate an intention, but I think in the broader discussion, it was mentioned also earlier today under the dual circulation strategy. I think we see a convergence of where the Belt and Road Initiative is going geographically. It has said, and also for the dual circulation, Wang Yi has explicitly said the focus will be ASEAN. And the second part is basically the trade policy that explicitly talks about regional economic integration. So basically, there's a strong strategic Chinese interest to stay at the core of all regional and global value chains that go through the most dynamic, basically region, or the most populous and the most growth contributing region. Very strong rationale for China. And I think then I'll just build on David. It's obvious that the EU relation is very dominant. We should not underestimate how much of the EU trade is basically also linked to Asian demand. So basically these two issues are interlinked, highly interlinked. I worked on a study and conducted a survey among Swiss SMEs last year. And the finding was actually that RCEP and CPTPP is not on top of everyone's mind. But I would then basically add that the trade compliance teams inside a company that basically look at FTAs are not those that initiate strategic shifts. It typically comes from a corporate strategy team. So it could also be some basically time lag. So I appreciate a lot that think tanks like Avenir Suisse or some selected trade associations, they actually put this very strategic topic of regional economic integration in the Asia Pacific really on the agenda, that it is being discussed in Switzerland.
Thank you. Kristy?
Yes, I fully support Ambassador Mahbubani's remarks that there should be as many FTA as possible, and we should also support the enlargement of the existing FTAs. For example, the enlargement of the RCEP, as well as the enlargement of the CPTPP. For example, the UK has applied for the membership of the CPTPP, and it's now currently negotiating with CPTPP member. And the UK government expect that they can complete a negotiation process within 2 years. And Ecuador in Latin America also apply for the CPTPP. So I believe for those who are interested in the CPTPP, they do have their own assessment by thinking that joining in such a trade agreement may benefit, if not all, but some particular sectors of the economy. And I believe that we should all support that all these FTA should not be politicized. For example, Taiwan has keen interest in participating in the CPTPP, but somehow because China is already there, so CPTPP members are considering either to combine Taiwan's application with Chinese application, or considering how to handle these two separate applications. So I think all small open economies should support that all FTAs should not be politicized. As long as economies, applicants can satisfy the standards for the case of Taiwan, because we are always regarded as an open economy, and we have already reviewed in Taiwan all this legislation for the CPTPP, and we should be supported to be part of this trade agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. It's a very good question. I thought, I'm thinking about it. I think basically the policy level of free trade agreement is really just one consideration among many for a company. And if you then also focus on SMEs, it will be more relationship based, or it will depend on infrastructure or logistics or the market, the products, the competitiveness, the brand, and so on. So there's many factors, but definitely it's one factor. And I was mentioning earlier that the strategic correlation between value chains and free trade agreements. So basically, as a company, you have to leverage these opportunities, because that's where the fundamental value chains are shaping up. I think inside an FTA, and we had Ambassador Etter earlier in a panel, he will know much better. But of course, if it really becomes crucial, then certain provisions that our teams are negotiating, they actually need to be activated. And these can be examples from IP. It could be state-owned enterprise, maybe a bit more difficult, investment protection, a dispute settlement. So it really depends whether an FTA has an enforcement mechanism and so. But I think if I add one more practical, basically data point, we in the same survey that I mentioned earlier, inquiring Swiss SMEs exporting and having business dealings with China on their use of the Sino-Swiss FTA. And there's always sample issues, whom you ask and who fills it out, of course. But there's basically only a 20% of companies that basically say that the growth or the positive business effect is causal to the FTA. And then a larger portion, about 35%, they say they have positive business effects, but it's not causally linked to the FTA. So basically, all in all, I think it's one of the considerations, but it's still something that on a policy level that is reflective of where value chains are going, and hence it's relevant for companies if they take a longer term perspective.
I'll be very quick. We also did a survey in Taiwan for all this business response to the forging of the CPTPP and RCEP. Large companies, since most of the large companies in Taiwan have facilities or operations in China, in one or two Southeast Asian countries, in Korea, or even in India. So large companies may not be badly affected by this FTA. On the contrary, they may benefit because they are Chinese company, they are Thailand company, they are Vietnamese company. But services company as well as smaller companies, since they cannot choose to invest in every country, so all these countries will be negatively impacted. Beyond that, we see both RCEP and CPTPP are forging new rules, as I mentioned, these trade facilitation rules, this custom harmonization, and these new digital rules on e-commerce and etc. So for companies, they have to have a mechanism to participate in this rule making procedures. So in that case, companies have to do whatever they can to either engage with the host economies or try to convince or encourage Taiwanese government to be part of this mechanism.
Kishore, yes?
Make a key point, which is that for companies, you got to go where the markets are, right? You have no choice. So 2 statistics. In the year 2009, the retail goods market in China was $1.8 trillion, and United States was $4 trillion, more than double that of China. 10 years later, in 2019, China's retail goods market was $6 trillion, and United States was only $5.5 trillion. So the Chinese market, and by the way, 2019 is a significant year. This is 2 years after Trump's trade war. He beat up China. China's retail goods market still kept growing. So you look for markets, you got to go where the markets are growing. And then another statistic, ASEAN. You know, in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN. Today, Japan's economy is only 1.5 times the size of ASEAN. By 2030, ASEAN's economy will be bigger than Japan's. So these are where the new markets are. And if you're a company, you have no choice. You have to go where the markets are calling you.
Markus? You also raised your hand?
Thanks. I'll just quickly add, basically, strategies that we see and we also advise on, basically dealing with this multipolar world, which is the theme today. We have 5 strategies. I'll just quickly go through them, and I'll rank them by what we see most relevant. So the first one is identification of real regulatory dilemmata, and basically then have targeted solutions. This is actually much less the case than we think, because most regulations come from US side. It's extraterritorial and it focuses on products, technology, or specific client types. But if you go through it, it's actually, you will see, for instance, for the Swiss economy, it's actually limited impact so far based on our understanding. Second one is localization. And hence also duplication, for instance, of R&D assets into China and then to produce for China in China. And then the third one I would say is diversification from China. It's this called China +1 strategy, which is definitely a good thing if you also listen to Ambassador Mahbubani, because they have to focus on the ASEAN market. And then a fourth one, which I find an interesting one that we observe, is companies basically raising their own internal policies, for instance, for ESG. So basically, they would first infringe their own policy before they infringe a US regulation, for instance, on pension funds and so on, whether they would allow an investment in China. And then the fifth one, the most extreme one, is basically full separation of supply chains and having basically different company setups.
I should not give you the answer, but I'll give it to you. The answer is no, or more accurately, not yet. And that's why the next 10 years are going to be some of the most significant 10 years in human history. You're going to see this massive power shift, okay, of a scale, as I said, we have never seen before in thousands of years. And that's why the next decade can either be incredibly promising or incredibly dangerous. And so my book discusses the promises and the dangers.
Very good. Well, thank you. What a closing statement for this session, for the whole of our think tank summit. Again, thanks a lot to our distinguished panelists today. I conclude this session and will go over to the closing remarks.